The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, like the Korean War and many wars to follow, was largely influenced by the Second World War before it. Due to the Japanese takeover of French Indochina in 1940, the Viet Minh was created as a communist coalition against the Vichy-Japanese collaboration. Following Japanese defeat in the Second World War, the major powers agreed that Indochina was to return to the French, and in 1946, when French Union forces returned to Indochina, the Viet Minh began a guerrilla war against them, which became the First Indochina War. France was ultimately defeated, departing Indochina 8 years later in 1954. As a result, Vietnam was divided into the Communist North under Ho Chi Minh and the pro-Western South under Diem. But the Communists desired a Vietnam united under communism, and the South desired a unified pro-Western Vietnam, and as a result, tension would escalate between the North and South, and US involvement would dramatically increase. The war officially began on November 1st, 1954. The Viet Cong, an insurgency group based in the south and supported by the north, undertook a guerrilla war against Diem's administration. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese forces pushed into neighbouring Laos, which enabled them to move south to strike South Vietnam on its western border. The US domino theory that if one nation fell to communism, the surrounding nations would too, meant increased US support to South Vietnam. On August 2nd, 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, where a US destroyer was supposedly fired upon by the North Vietnamese, but the claims of this incident are seen as false. Regardless, the supposed attack ultimately brought American combat troops to Vietnam the following year on March 8th. Also, the US began an intensive bombing campaign against the North as a result. But this war was different to other wars the US had been involved in. They were now fighting an unseen enemy, one that could blend into the civilian population and attack at any moment. This was the Viet Cong. As they were scattered throughout South Vietnam, there was no established front line. Therefore, US strategy leaned towards simply killing as many Viet Cong as it could. This type of warfare, which ravaged through Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, stretched on for many years, claiming the lives of millions of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of Americans. For the first time, a US war was broadcasted throughout American homes on a large scale, and as a result, US involvement was heavily influenced by the opinion of the American people. On January 30th, 1968, Communist forces launched the Tet Offensive, which became the turning point in the war. Although it was a military failure for the North, which left the Viet Cong largely depleted, it soon became a political victory as the American people lost hope for a victory in Vietnam, and the American public increasingly distrusted the military and the Johnson administration as they led them to believe that a victory was near. Public opinion hit an all-time low, which, coupled with protests throughout the US, meant the next phase would see the withdrawal of American forces from Indochina between 1969 and 1973, and the eventual takeover of South Vietnam by North Vietnamese forces. The Vietnam War was a very costly and controversial war that had many global impacts. Communism spread throughout Indochina, taking over the countries of South Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos. The new Socialist Republic of Vietnam was left devastated because of the war. Estimates of Vietnamese dead is numbered between 3 and 4 million, with around 3 million left wounded and 12 million becoming refugees. And as a result of the extensive US bombing campaign, most of Vietnamese industry, housing and infrastructure had been destroyed. In total, the US dropped over 7 million tons of bombs on Indochina, 3 times the amount it dropped in all of World War II. The US spent nearly $135 billion on the Vietnam War, which in today's currency numbers well over $1 trillion. Not only this, the war pierced the myth of American invincibility, which would scathe the military for years to follow, and a divide formed among the American people. Soviet support to Vietnam continued throughout the 1970s and 80s, while the situation between China and the Soviet Union continued to deteriorate. Trade and diplomatic relations between Vietnam and the United States resumed in 1995. Thanks for watching, be sure to subscribe for more videos like this.